Rabbi, we cannot hear you.
Oh, sorry about that. Sorry. Finally, I just decided to go on the phone instead of the computer. Hopefully, from that at this point on, you'll be able to hear and we can move forward. Okay. Sorry. I'm reading the Parsha in a nutshell. Here we go. The name of the Parsha is Behar, which means on mountain. Behar is mountain, and is found in Leviticus chapter 25. Okay. On Mount Sinai, God communicates to Moses the laws of the sabbatical year. Every seventh year, all work on the land should cease, and its produce becomes free for the taking for all man and beast. So we're allowed to work the land for 6 years. The seventh year, the same model of Shabbat, where we have 6 days a week. On the seventh day, we rest. Here you have 6 days of work. Seventh year, the land has to rest. You can't work the land. Applies specifically to the land of Israel. 7 sabbatical cycles are followed by a 50th year, the Jubilee year, on which work on the land ceases. All indentured servants are set free, and all ancestral estates in the Holy Land that have been sold revert to their original owners. So this is very interesting. One issue is that all the servants go free. You go to Philadelphia and you visit the Liberty Bell. You see the verse that is proclaimed on the Liberty Bell is the verse from this week's Parsha that on Yom Kippur they sound the shofar and they call freedom for the land for all its inhabitants. So that's the Jubilee year. That's one aspect that the servants go free. Another aspect, which is in some ways, which is very interesting, is that all land goes back to its original owners. In the land of Israel, you could sell, biblical Israel, you could only sell land. I guess it's like a long-term lease. The 50th year, all the land goes back to the original owner. In a way, okay, so there's a lot to talk about. In any case, Behar also contains additional laws governing the sale of lands and the prohibitions against fraud and usury. So that's the big picture. That's the Parsha in a nutshell. The question is, what are the big ideas here? And how do we apply it? What do they mean to us, especially today? We don't really practice the law of the we don't practice the law of the Jubilee. And according to many opinions, even the sabbatical is only biblical, is only rabbinic. There's a debate whether the sabbatical year, when you don't have a Jubilee, whether that's biblical or rabbinic. Most of the people say rabbinic, but of course the lessons are, of course, relevant to us. Okay. What is the big idea here? What is the common thread between the various laws of the Parsha, especially the end that are not mentioned here at great length? It's just here short in the nutshell. It's just very short. What happens in this Parsha is that the Torah is telling us we're going to come to the land of Israel. And the question is there a way to balance the concepts of, let's say, a free market where people can work hard and earn and expand their wealth, but also, to some degree, protect the ideas and values of equality, that people, everybody, could have a foundation of wealth in the land, and that's, of course, related to owning land. And the systems of government that we know, political systems that we know, are usually one or the other. It's usually either free market, people can become more wealthy, and then the poor could become more poor, etc. Or you could say, well, there are systems, socialism, and that would say, you know what, you want everybody to be the same. And of course, the dangers of that we saw in the 20th century, but even if we don't take it to that extreme, the danger is that that does not allow for ambition and people to want to grow their wealth, and therefore advance, and therefore ultimately advance society. So what it seems is what the Torah is telling us here in the system of the sabbatical, and especially the system of the Jubilee, is that we want to do a little bit of both. In other words, you could become a wealthy landowner if you are so inclined, but there's almost like a reset, not almost, there's a reset to the economy every 50 years. The land will go back to its owners. So even as someone who is impoverished and therefore forced to sell their inheritance and their connection to the land of Israel, they know that the land will come back to either them or their children, and that is keeping them in the land of Israel. And also, right, their hope is the future is in the land of Israel, and also gives them a basis for economic prosperity in the future. So that's one way to think about it, that there's some balance between the various systems of government or political systems. And that's what the balance that Torah is seeking to strike. It's, of course, not always easy to strike a perfect balance. And even today, we don't really have the model of the Jubilee, because the Jubilee, built into this Jubilee, is that the land goes back to its original owner, but that applies when all the Jewish people are living in Israel, and it's divided based on the land is divided based on the ancestral division for the tribes. So you have to all the tribes have to be there. So technically this doesn't work, but you see that the Torah is trying to strike that balance, and it does so with the system of the Jubilee and the sabbatical. So that's general terms. Another interesting thing that you see here, and that you see at other places in the Torah, that ironically, the systems, we see this in the 20th century and before, some systems that try to create equality between people, they end up causing a lot of damage, and they end up, in the name of that equality, harming many, many people. And what you see here is the Torah connects the equality to the recognition of Hashem. So the sabbatical year, every 7 years, you have to let the land rest, and you have to letting the land rest is just one component. You also have to allow anybody who wants to come and eat of the produce in the land, right? Let's say it's not grain, but it's a tree, it's an orchard. So anybody can come and eat the fruit of your orchard. So the Torah emphasizes again and again that it involves and brings in the concept of Hashem. Because the land belongs to Hashem, because I am Hashem, therefore we keep the laws of the sabbatical and the Jubilee. In other words, the notion that all people are created equal, and therefore you have to look at and protect the rights of everybody. In some ways, if you don't have the component of recognizing why are all people equal, why should people have this protection, it's because of the image of God within every person. In other words, it's because of Hashem. And what that does, that would protect against the corruption of this concept of socialism, because if it's because Hashem sets it, then it has to be by the rules of Hashem. And you see that also, it's an interesting thing that you see when it says, love your fellow as yourself, which is probably one of the most famous commandments in the Torah. What is not as famous is the continuation of the verse, Ani Hashem, I am the Lord. In other words, why do you love your fellow as yourself? Because every person has a spark of Hashem within them. So that is a little bit of an introduction. And I think now we could start talking about specific details. What happens is the opening statement, we'll get back to the opening statement, the sabbatical and the Jubilee, we'll get back to this, hopefully, God willing, in good health. But I want to also focus on later on in the Parsha. In other words, almost the order of laws in the Parsha. And I'm going to try to do this very briefly, but we'll try to do this nonetheless. Torah reading. Okay, so reading number 1, we read about the sabbatical year. Okay, beautiful. And the Jubilee. Wonderful. Then you get to reading number 2. We basically say, now that the law of the Jubilee is set up, the Torah tells us when you sell your land, you have to think about the price of the land, and the way you determine the price of land is how much wheat or how much grain or how much it could produce, depending on the amount of years until the Jubilee, right? So if there's 5 years left to the Jubilee, then you calculate how much profit you can get the land for 5 years. So that's the first thing. Then the Torah continues and talks about, hey, there's a question about we can eat at the Jubilee. We'll eat that in a minute. What happens if somebody has to sell their land because they're poor? So then there's all kinds of laws where the relative of the person who sold the land could buy back the land at the price of the sale up to the Jubilee. In other words, you don't only have to wait for the Jubilee, you can also wait during at any point in most cases, there's exceptions, but in most cases, if someone sells their land and the Jubilee is 49 years away, and 10 years later their brother makes a few dollars, their brother or their family member can buy back the land, or if the person himself who sold it now has money, can come buy back the land for the price, for the original sale price. So again, protection to the person who was desperate enough to sell their land, which is something a person should not do or does not do in an agricultural society, where the base of the sustenance is the land. Okay, and then there are some exceptions about that. And the Torah continues, what happens if somebody is so poor that they actually have to sell themselves as a servant? So the point is, there's all kinds of laws that they would go out at the Jubilee, and there's protections for the servants, but also there also has to be, as we see at the end, that somebody sells themselves as a servant, a relative can buy that person back. In other words, pay the money of the sale, and the person goes free, even before the Jubilee, and that is the law. Okay. So we have a lot of laws of protection, but the rabbis already point out that the trajectory of this parsha is going downward. In other words, we're talking about somebody who, in the beginning, had land. Then they were so poor, they had to sell their land. Then they became even more poor, and they have to sell themselves to a Jew, and then sell themselves to a non-Jew. And this whole discussion about how you can redeem them from the non-Jew. And essentially, the trajectory is very bad. And the question is, what is the Torah telling us by ordering the portions in this way? And one interpretation that the rabbis give is that it is basically a cautionary tale. Cautionary tale is you have to keep the sabbatical year, but the sabbatical year is a very difficult thing to do. It's difficult today. It was difficult then. And historically, the Jewish people did not always keep it properly, because it's a very big challenge. It's a very difficult mitzvah to sort of stop the entire economy for a year. Very difficult thing to do. So, in fact, next week's parsha, we'll talk about that maybe in a few minutes. Next week's parsha also talks about the notion of that the exile, talks about the exile in next week's parsha, and it says when the Jewish people will be in exile, the land will rest because it didn't rest during the sabbatical years. In other words, in the story, the way it's told, the way the exile is told in the book of Leviticus next week, it's the consequence for not keeping the sabbatical year. So what am I saying? I'm saying that keeping this mitzvah, keeping the sabbatical year was a very great challenge, a very difficult thing to do. Okay, let's continue. What happens if somebody does not keep the sabbatical year? And here, according to the rabbis, that's what the Torah is alluding to by describing the events in this parsha in a way that it's in a descending way, sort of spiraling out of control. Person doesn't keep Shemitah, they may come to have to sell their land. And after that, if they don't keep it, again, they have to sell themselves to a Jew, to a Gentile, and you need somebody else to come redeem you. So that's one way of looking at the portions descending. But another way of looking at it, there are various ways of looking at it. It's also, in a way, more modern way of reading this is that, in a way, it's inevitable. If you are coming into the land of Israel, and now you're moving away from the model of the desert where all your needs were met, and the Jews ate manna from the heaven, and they studied Torah, and now they come into Israel and they say, okay, unleash your creative power, unleash your desire for success. It's almost inevitable that part of the race to success is to take advantage of somebody else's misfortune. Right? The other person is poor, so he hasn't settled land, so let me buy it. And you'll see in a minute, the Torah gives us some protections. And ultimately buying somebody else, again, is a sign of a person taking, I don't want to say taking advantage, but you see that there's going to be some people who are more fortunate, less fortunate, and in a way that is a direct result of the economic system of, I don't want to call, I guess you can call it capitalism. And the Torah is basically telling us that this is the natural order unless you step in and put safety nets and put guardrails to protect against a person descending so low. This is the natural result. And that's one way of looking at it. Another way of looking at it, this is the Rebbe's commentary, is we go back to the beginning, which we'll talk about hopefully soon. I'm touching on a lot of subjects here. But this is one of the only parshas where the introduction to this parsha is, and the Lord spoke to Moses on Mount Sinai, saying, speak to the children of Israel, and you shall say to them, when you come to the land that I am giving you, the land shall rest a Shabbat for the Lord. So the mitzvah of Shemitah is introduced by the mitzvah of by the introduction that this mitzvah was said at Sinai, and the idea is that the rabbis in the Medrash already ask, Ma inyan Shemitah etzel Har Sinai? What does Shemitah, what does the sabbatical year have to do with Mount Sinai? And it continues and it says, all the mitzvot were said at Sinai. Now this phrase, what does Shemitah have to do with Sinai, actually comes into even modern Hebrew. And people say it without knowing the source of this statement. When you want to say in modern Hebrew, what does one thing have to do with the other? You say, what does Shemitah have to do with Sinai? The question is, why are we mentioning Sinai, specifically with the mitzvah of the sabbatical, which is Shemitah, and not any other mitzvah? So there must be some connection between the theme of the sabbatical and the theme of Sinai. And there are all kinds of interpretations, which we don't have to get into right now. What I want to say, what the Rebbe said, is what is the purpose of Mount Sinai? When you think of Sinai, you think about the Torah. What is the purpose of the Torah? And in a way, the purpose of the Torah, people could think about the Torah, is here to help us grow and become more spiritual and become closer to Hashem. And all this is true. But that's so in a way, what is the purpose of the Torah? People would think the purpose of the Torah is sort of to go upward, to elevate us, to bring us closer to Hashem. And all that is true, but that's not the ultimate goal of the Torah. The ultimate goal of the Torah is actually to sanctify life on this earth. And in some ways, I want to take it to the extreme, it's to sanctify the places on earth or the places within society that are in some ways the lowest situations. In other words, even a place that descends to a very low spiritual state, even those places could be affected and illuminated and inspired and protected by the Torah. And that's why, look at the beginning of the Parsha as Mount Sinai. We talk about, if you want to look at the Parsha, we start with Mount Sinai, but where does the Parsha continue? The Parsha continues and goes toward describing a society where someone is so poor and they have to sell themselves not only to a Jew, but to a Gentile, where the person is not protected as much as he would be protected under a Jew, if he sold to a Jew. And yet the Torah says, okay, how are we going to help this person? How are we going to protect this person? And that is the purpose of the Torah, to influence every area of society. No place in society do we say, oh, it's just too messy there, and the Torah can't help us. So in some ways, that's if you want to talk about the trajectory of the Torah, we start in a very spiritual place where a person would stop learning, stop working for a year, and dedicate the land to God and rest and maybe study Torah during that year. But it's certainly a spiritually elevated space. And then we continue to somebody who's so poor he has to sell his land and sell himself to a Gentile. And the rabbis actually say that one of the meanings of the verse is sell themselves to serve, to take care of the idol itself. And then we say, the Torah says, okay, we have to worry about that person. That is the person you have to worry about. And that's the testament that the Torah is fulfilling its ultimate goal. And that's why we start the Parsha with at Mount Sinai, because that's the testament of what the Torah is. The whole purpose of Sinai is not only to elevate us, but also to sanctify every place within society. So that is a little bit about the general aspects of the Parsha, where we're going with this Parsha. And now we can start talking about specifics. In the meantime, if anyone has any comments or questions, please share. Otherwise, we continue. Okay, the first thing that is interesting to point out is to point out that the obvious, to point out the obvious, and that is that the model of the sabbatical is, like I mentioned, is like the model of Shabbat. You have 6 days a week, and then we rest, and then you have 6 years of labor in the field, and then you let the land rest. Now the question is as follows. The question is, why is it that Shabbat applies to every area and every space, wherever a person is, Shabbat applies. They don't say that Shabbat doesn't apply because we're in Connecticut. No, the message of Shabbat, that God created the world in 6 days, and on the 7th day He rested. That message is universal, and because it's universal, it has to be celebrated. It has to be commemorated everywhere. Okay. If that's the case, then the question is asked, so how come in the land of it, the same model of 7, 6, and 7, which and the Torah refers to it as Shabbat, the Shabbat of the land, you would also expect that to be everywhere. The land belongs to God everywhere. So if the land belongs to God everywhere, then in every space, wherever we would be, seemingly the law of the sabbatical should apply wherever we are. If you're outside of Israel, if you're in Connecticut, you also should be able to work the land only for 6 years. And on the 7th day, the land should rest. In other words, what does the sabbatical have to do with the land of Israel more than any other place? Shabbat, the concept of Shabbat, is not connected to Israel more than any other place. So that's the question. One answer is that who says this? Oh, this is from the Alshich. Yeah, this is from the Alshich. So he's a great mystic. He lived in Tzfat in the 1500s, and he wrote a commentary on the Torah, and he puts this in his commentary. Very beautiful. He says like this: the notion that the land belongs to Hashem, because Hashem created the world in 6 days and rested on the 7th day, and therefore the land belongs to Hashem, which is basically what we're reminded by this sabbatical and the Jubilee. Torah keeps saying the land is not yours. The land belongs to Hashem. Therefore, on the 7th day you rest, and therefore you can't sell it. You can only sell it if it's yours, right? If it's yours, if you own it, you could sell it. What happens if you don't own it? If you don't own it, you can't sell it. The land belongs to God. God gave it to you, but you can't sell it. You could lease it, but you can't sell it. You could lease it to a fellow up to the 50th year. Okay, so why is this notion connected more to the land of Israel? So the Alshich quotes the first Rashi of the Torah. The first Rashi of the Torah is the Medrash. Rashi quotes the Medrash. Rabbi Yitzchak says that why does the Torah begin with the story of creation? Says Rabbi Yitzchak, and this is a Rashi that I've quoted very often, says Rabbi Yitzchak, because the people of the world, remember he's living 2,000 years ago, Rashi's living a little bit less than 1,000 years ago, and this Rashi, the first Rashi of the Torah, sounds like it comes from the morning news. What does Rashi say, quoting the Medrash? The people of the world are going to tell the Jewish people, you are thieves. Why are you thieves? Because you stole the land of Israel, where there's the land of 7 nations. There were 7 nations that were in the land of Israel, and they were the indigenous people. And we come in, and we took the land from them. So we're thieves. So that's the claim against the Jewish people. Right? Even till today, you open your Facebook, all you're going to see people fighting. Who are the true natives of the land of Israel? Well, we think it's the Jews. That's why we think the Jews are the natives of Judea. But it all depends how far you go back. If you go back before the land of Israel, or before the land of Judea, it was called the land of Canaan. Even in the Torah, it's called the land of Canaan. So we came and we displaced 7 nations, and the facts are here. It's in the Torah. And that's the first Rashi of the Torah. So how could we do it? The nations of the world say, who are you to come and take the land of the 7 nations? And what is our answer? Our answer is that the entire land belongs to Hashem, because Hashem created the world, which is why the Torah begins with the story of creation. The land belongs to God, and Hashem gave it to the 7 nations. And then Hashem took it from the 7 nations and gave it to us. And that's our justification to the land. The justification to the land is not that we were there for 3,000 years, or a bit more, 3,300 years. That's not our justification, because what happened before that? Justification is the land belongs to God, and God promised us this land in the Torah to our forefathers and gives it to us. And that's a justification for the land. That's what it says in the first Rashi. And that's why the Torah starts with the story of creation to highlight this point. Okay. What does the Moshe Alshich say? What does the Alshich say? Says the Alshich, in Israel, we have to keep remembering this point. When we are in the land of Israel, and the claim that we're taking, oh, by the way, he lived in Israel. The Alshich lived in Sfat. So maybe he's thinking about this. When we're in the land of Israel, we have to justify, even more than other places, why we're living there. And the answer is because it's God's land, and God gave it to us. So if you have to highlight that it's God's land, and that's your justification for being there, then specifically in the land of Israel, you have to do things to make it obvious that to you and to everybody around you that you are conscious and you're cognizant and you are grateful that you're here because of God, not because of your own might, not because of your military conquests. And therefore, specifically in Israel, it's critical that we do a mitzvah, such an important mitzvah, and it's something that's so obvious and in a way so difficult, by resting in the 7th year to show that the land belongs to Hashem, because you can't live in Israel if it's not obvious to you and to everybody that the land belongs to Hashem. And that's why Shemitah, even though, yes, the concept that Hashem created the world, all the earth belongs to God. That's universal. And that's why Shabbat is celebrated everywhere. But in Israel, it's even that much more important, because recognizing that truth is actually the foundation of our right to the land of Israel. So that's a little bit about that, about the reason of why the sabbatical, which is a beautiful mitzvah, applies specifically in Israel. Okay. Another point to make is the idea of this. We want to move a little bit now, a little more forward to the story of the Jubilee. So I'm going to read a few of the verses, and I'll read 2-3 verses. We don't need more than that. So I'm looking at it. I can't share the screen here, but if you look at Leviticus chapter 25, verse 8. So we talked about the laws. Oh, it's beautiful, actually. Very interesting. There's 7 laws, 7 verses. The first 7 verses discuss the sabbatical. And then we move on. So it needs 7 verses discuss the sabbatical, and then we move to the laws of the Jubilee in year number 8. That's cute. And you shall count for yourself 7 sabbatical years, 7 years, 7 times. And the days of these 7 sabbatical years shall amount to 49 years for you, right? So after the 7 years, which are the first 7 verses in the Parsha, discuss the sabbatical. Now we move on and we say, okay, now start counting sabbaticals. Count 7 sabbaticals. Okay. And then you get 49 days. What happens after those 49 years? What happens after those 49 years? You shall proclaim with shofar blasts in the 7th month, on the 10th of the month, on the Day of Atonement, you shall sound the shofar throughout the land. And then verse 10 is the verse that in some translation is inscribed on a Liberty Bell. We'll get in that, maybe we check in a second. But in any case, it's this verse. And you shall sanctify the 50th year and proclaim freedom throughout the land for all who live on it. It shall be a jubilee for you, and you shall return each man to his property, and you shall return each man to his family. Those are the verses. The 3 verses that you want to mention. I'm just opening up a Liberty Bell to see what translation they have. Let's figure it out. Bell. Inscription. Okay, so it's like this. It's the King James Version. It reads as follows, chapter 25 of Leviticus, verse 10. Proclaim liberty throughout all the lands unto all its inhabitants, unto all the inhabitants thereof. That's according to, actually, it's not even Google, it's Google's AI. So this may be wrong. But in any case, you get what I'm saying. It's this verse. Okay, so what is interesting about this Jubilee? Jubilee, you proclaim the Yovel in Hebrew. By the way, the word Yovel, I don't know what Jubilee means celebration, I don't know, but the Yovel comes from the word, one of the names for a shofar is Yovel, if I'm not mistaken. So the Jubilee year is related to the word for a shofar. So what's happening here, what's interesting here is that the 50th year, you proclaim liberty and freedom for all the people in the land, and you do so by blowing the shofar. Now, I asked you a question, and by reading those 3 verses, you may have a hint. When on the 50th year do the servants go free, the slaves go free? It could be the beginning, it could be the end, it could be throughout. When does it happen throughout the year? So,
On Yom Kippur.
oh, Yom Kippur. Now, Yom Kippur is a very strange time. It's an arbitrary time. I would say the beginning. It should be the beginning. 50th year has arrived. Everyone should go free. Or maybe the end. But maybe if you ask me, I would say the 50th year. 50th year is freedom. Okay, so it should be Rosh Hashanah. But Vicky's right. It's Yom Kippur. How do we know it's Yom Kippur? That's exactly what the Torah says. The Torah says in the 50th year shall proclaim with the shofar blasts in the 7th month, on the 10th of the month. And by the way, sometimes the Torah tells you about Yom Kippur, like Rosh Hashanah, it's called this first of the 7th. And Yom Kippur, in some cases, is the 10th day of the 7th month. Here, there's no mistake. It says it clearly, 10th of the 7th month, and then it says on the day of atonement, the Yom HaKippurim, the day of atonement. You shall sound the shofar throughout your land. And that brings the freedom. So of all the days of the year, 365 days of the year, the freedom happens on Yom Kippur. And the question is why? If you love the shofar, Rosh Hashanah, you also love the shofar. So one way to think about it is that the model of what happens in the Jubilee is really what happens on Yom Kippur. By the way, it's not. Okay, I'm going to tell you a story. And I'm not going to tell you if I'm talking about a spiritual story or economic story, but I'm telling you a story. There was once upon a time, there was this person, and this person made bad decisions. And as the result of those bad decisions, the person now becomes more limited and less opportunity. And eventually, what we do is we give this person an opportunity to come back to the previous state. Okay, I just gave you a sermon. What am I talking about? I could be talking about the Jubilee. The person made bad financial decisions, had no choice but to sell the land. And then at the Jubilee, you go back to the land. I could also be talking about a person's own spiritual journey throughout the year. Throughout the year, I make negative choices. And Yom Kippur is this time of atonement, the teshuvah, and then those negative choices are corrected, and I return to my previous self. So which story was I saying? I was saying both, because what happens, the story of Jubilee is just an application of the model that we do every year on Rosh Hashanah and culminating with Yom Kippur, just applying it to the financial world. In other words, to the real world, to the world of ownership and land. But the model is the same. So we're playing out in the real world the theme of Yom Kippur. That's exactly what the Jubilee is. And that's why it's very interesting that usually when we talk in English, because we're affected by capitalism and stuff, what did I say? I said the land goes back to the original owner. Probably if I play maybe I'll ask AI to do this, find out how many times I said that phrase. The land will go back to the original owner. That is a wonderful phrase. The only problem is that's not what the Torah says. The land does not go back to the original owner. The original owner goes back to the land, right? When I sell my land, what happens? Not that land is not like a movable object. I sell my bottle of water, the bottle of water now goes away from me. But if I sell my land, what happens is I am now being displaced from my land. I'm going away from my natural space and from the place of my ancestors and from the place where I belong. And the Jubilee is not that the land comes back to me. That's if you're thinking about the ownership model. So you would say the land comes back to me. But the Jubilee really is, the Torah says it, each person will return to his estate, to his inheritance, and to his family, meaning the family estate. If you look at verse 10 again, you shall sanctify the 50th year and proclaim freedom for slaves throughout the land. for all who live on it. It shall be a jubilee for you, and you shall return each man to his property, and you shall return each man to his family. In other words, the jubilee, what the jubilee is saying, and Yovel is saying, come back to where you really belong. And that statement, come back to where you really belong, which is the statement of the Jubilee, is the statement of Yom Kippur. That's what Yom Kippur is. Because again, we talk about this all the time, that Teshuvah doesn't mean start a new path. Teshuvah means return to your core, return to who you really are. Because the negative decision is a step away from your natural self. So here you see, why is the Jubilee happening on Yom Kippur? Because both the Jubilee and Yom Kippur is the same theme, which is a person makes a mistake, would make a bad decision, there are negative consequences, come back to self, come back to family, come back to your history. So every Yom Kippur we do it within the self, but in the Jubilee we're actually doing it and applying that model to the economy. So I thought that's a beautiful idea. And it's interesting that we'll explain why we don't say return the land goes back to its owner, the owner goes back to its land. You go back to your natural space. That's what Yovel is. That's what Teshuvah is. Okay, so that's something new for this year, but I don't think we said that in the past. So thank you everybody for joining. And comments, questions, of course, welcome. Otherwise, have a wonderful day. We should see each other in good health, and may we all return to the land of Israel, return to our natural habitat. And everybody should recognize the right of the Jewish people to the land of Israel, because we recognize that it's not our might and not our power. Rather, it's Hashem. The world belongs to Hashem, and Hashem gave it to us. And that's our right to the land. So thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi. Shabbat Shalom.
Thank you, Vicky. Be well. Shabbat Shalom.